From games, movies, and television shows, both old and new, science fiction has always represented something that we've tried to attain. It gives us a way to imagine the future before we can actually build it. From the biggest games to the smallest movies, science fiction has always captured people's interest. Because it always asks us to imagine what might be possible. And games like Space Engineers gave us something different. They gave us an outlet to actually try to build that future, to design the ships we imagined, to build the stations we saw in movies, to create machines, colonies, and worlds based on our own ideas what the future might look like. They gave us a medium where we weren't simply watching someone else's vision of the future. We could build our own. From rebuilding ships that I built 10 years ago to building completely new ships because the game gives me a reason to, Space Engineers 2 gives us the opportunity to really expand on what our expectations are of the future of this game. The most important thing to talk about, I think, moving forward, is going to be the features, gameplay systems, and the overall shape of the game is taking. First, let's go over some of the biggest differences between Space Engineers 1 and Space Engineers 2. Player spaces, sectors, colonization, and the overall drive and direction of the new game. Generally speaking, Space Engineers 1 lacked direction for players. The recent prototype boss encounters and the additions to it in the latest update are one of the only meaningful drivers of large-scale manufacturing and combat in the game. There are many individual mechanics that have changed significantly over the last few years of Space Engineers 1, but those additions do not fix the central problem. The core game lacks the kind of drive that many players associate with an actual game. And that's not to be negative, it's what it is. Space Engineers is a sandbox game, at least the first game was. But being sandbox doesn't mean it cannot have systems that push players towards goals, objectives, or different styles of play. The challenge is balancing the sandbox elements with the more directed parts of the game. Ideally, those two sides should be distributed relatively evenly, and the sandbox should remain available within, more directed parts of the game. For example, me being able to build a bunch of components rather than trying to do what the contract says, go to the base, build a bunch of the assembly blocks needed to build those components, and then build the components. I could just go do it. This is an important part of the direction of Space Engineers 2, and we have already seen firsthand through the new colonization system and the new contracts. I think Keen took a step back from the story and some of the overall progression in the last update because of the community's reaction to the beginning of the game feeling too easy. I understand these complaints. However, I think that it's a small issue compared to the much larger picture and the broad changes happening across the game. Let's talk about the scale and the travel. The scale of Space Engineers 2 is significantly larger and more compact at the same time. What does that mean? The overall size of the player system appears to be relatively similar, but the way players move around and interact with the space is changing. We still have not seen jump drives as of 2.3, although they are currently present in the game files alongside the water-related blocks, which are very cool by the way. Right now, we see more of a limited jump and tunnel system being used between stations as a primary form of long-distance transportation during the early game. I assume this will change later on because jump drives have not yet been fully implemented, and the current travel system may eventually be used less often, or maybe restricted in some ways. Maybe a math-based limitation would be one of the better approaches to that, actually. The next major change is the difference in asteroid consistency and location. In Space Engineers 1, asteroids have essentially been scattered shotgun style across the entire system for as long as the game has existed. Only certain mods allowed players to create planetary rings that were actually worth using. And planetary rings are much larger chains than many people realize because they introduce constraints into the gameplay. Asteroids can still be found throughout space, but they appear to be much rarer than they were before. Materials in Space Engineers 2 are more heavily clustered around planetary rings and other orbital regions throughout the system. This creates several important things. The biggest one is a choke point. A choke point is effectively a location where the activity is narrowed or condensed into a particular area. This is important for single player and multiplayer alike. Asteroid rings can become territories, regions, sectors, and primary locations where missions, factions, points of interest, and specialized zones can exist. In a previous write-up, I talked about regional areas having different rules and attributes. Some territories might prevent certain blocks from functioning altogether. Reactors, railguns, scanners, and other late-game technologies might not work within these specific regions, forcing players to rely on other lower-grade technologies. Other regions could interfere with long-range scanning or reduce sensor effectiveness. There are many different attributes, restrictions, and environmental rules that could be created, condensing the areas where players are encouraged to live while still keeping the overall world extremely large. That maintains the massive scale that Space Engineers is known for while giving important locations more purpose. A new technical foundation. Let's talk about the foundational technology differences between Space Engineers 1 and Space Engineers 2. Obviously, the game is running on the new engine, which means Keen can do bigger and better things. And when I say they can probably do big and better things, I mean they are. They're currently working on the FPS AI, which is expected to be implemented in a later update this year, along with the water update planned for early next year. Just those two mechanics alone fundamentally change the game, and we haven't even gotten to the new stuff that they plan on. We haven't even gotten a glimpse of that. The reason that these are such significant changes is they do not only change individual mechanics, they also give players more environments to engineer around and more choices to make. That is the philosophy behind all of my write-ups and videos that I create. I want the community talking about the engineering challenges and choices that players should be able to make. Space Engineers 1 already does this, and it's relatively good. However, adding more game-like features would turn into a completely different experience, and I believe it would be better for it. Think about being able to scan players at longer or shorter ranges. Think about designing a ship for stealth operations. You could reduce your signature, creep towards another ship, board it through FPS combat, and capture it before the crew had a meaningful chance to react. AI or players. Alternatively, you could build the biggest, largest, most powerful battleship in the sector and accept that it can be detected from 500,000 kilometers away. Those are engineering decisions. Those are meaningful trade-offs. At the end of the day, the game is called Space Engineers. With the second version of the game and direction shown in the 2.3 update, Keen has a great deal of opportunity to expand the game like features of Space Engineers 2. Features and systems for the future. Now let's talk about some of the future features that I have already discussed, suggested, and hinted at. Colonization appears to be one of the main gameplay loops that the game will use. Expanding on this idea could potentially allow the same system to be used for servers and multiplayer environments for contested regions or faction territory. There are many things that Keen could eventually do with this, and the only idea that I have about where the system might be heading is admittedly large and possibly outlandish. However, the colonization, using a sector system, and the new map already dividing the world into defined regions, and territorial gameplay is something that could potentially be implemented much later. And I do mean much later. Let's come back down to the ground for a minute. Keen has discussed AI, factions, story content, and other forms of progression based around sector and region systems in Space Engineers 2. What we could possibly expect from certain sectors will be contested or controlled by different factions. Those areas could offer different mission types, different authorities, and different objectives. We can also probably expect ships used by those factions to look different, alongside changes with their missions, technologies, and behavior. There will also likely be some form of reputation system connected to those factions, but we don't really know how far that will go. The colonization system could tie all of this together, alongside a larger story. The important thing to understand is that the systems that are being built for a specific purpose. That purpose is to build a game on top of the sandbox. Not only Space Engineers, the sandbox, a full game built around the sandbox. As always, Space Engineers should give players the opportunity to not participate in those systems. That's fine. That's how it should work, and that is what the different starting options should allow. However, Keen should not move away from its vision of creating a long-term, open-world survival crafting multiplayer game that also contains story and progression. Features versus systems. One of the biggest differences between Space Engineers 1 and what I hope for Space Engineer 2 becomes the difference between features and systems. Space Engineers 1 has a lot of individual features. What it does not have is a lot of larger gameplay systems. Systems that interact with one another. The industrial and the economic gameplay is probably the best example of a true system in the original game. Mining feeds production, production feeds construction, construction feeds expansion and combat, and those mechanics all rely on one another to create a larger gameplay loop. However, mainline combat, on the other hand, is mostly made up of individual features rather than interconnected systems. Weapons are a feature, armor is a feature, turrets are a feature, but there's very little interaction between those mechanics that is, let's say, below the surface. Even the Factorum, while an interesting addition, is closer to an individual feature than a larger gameplay system. It exists largely within its own gameplay loop and has relatively little interaction with the rest of the game outside. The same can be said for pirates. Pirates are a feature. They are something that exists in the world, but they are not part of a larger gameplay system that continuously drives players' decision making or meaningfully changes how the rest of the game function. So what do I mean by a system? A system is a collection of mechanics that interact with one another that create new gameplay through those interactions. Let's take, for example, my radar and scanning proposal. By itself, a radar block, or just the system, is just a feature. However, when that radar system is connected to ship signature, heat generation, and power consumption, environmental conditions, active scanning, passive scanning, stealth coatings potentially, and ship design, it stops being a feature. It becomes a gameplay system. Now, every engineering decision the player makes affects something else. Generating more heat increases your signature. Increasing your signature makes you easier to detect. And being easier to detect changes how enemies engage you. That affects how you should design your ship, which affects your power requirements, which affects your industrial needs, which affects the kinds of resources you need to gather. One system has now reached into combat, engineering, industry, exploration, and progression simultaneously. That's the difference. Features give players something new to use. Systems give players new decisions to make. And I believe Space Engineers 2 has an opportunity to build far more systems than the original game ever had. And that, more than anything, is what excites me about the future of the game. Building a real game. When you bring all of these ideas together, you begin to see what Space Engineers could actually become. You have a game with multiple systems that interact with one another, and you have natural reasons for players to do things instead of entirely relying on contracts to tell them where to go and what to accomplish. Or alternatively, not having a sandbox that doesn't give you any direction at all other than, some of the later game stuff. You have decisions that must be made based on the regions players are entering, the enemies that they expect to fight, the resources available there, and the technology they can rely on. You have an entirely new information game built around long-range scanning, radar signature, heat, and many other mechanics I have discussed in my previous write-ups. When all those systems began working together, even if they just implement those kinds of things at the very basic level, you no longer have just Space Engineers 2, you have Space Engineers 2 the game. And on top of all of those systems, you have the features Keem already appears to be working with. You have the colonization system, you have the story, you have the larger world. You have the grander lore that Space Engineers 2 appears to be building towards. And I want the community to see that vision. I want the community to see the vision that Merrick seems to see, the team seems to see. It's not simply another attempt at making a good version of the game, or another update. It's an opportunity to build a completely new game on top of the foundation of the original, while expanding on everything Keem learned from it. Not taking away any of the core that Space Engineers was, but just building everything on top of it, and giving the opportunity to the players to really, see the difference. It's important to remember that the development pace we are seeing, in roughly 1.5 years, Space Engineers 2 has effectively reached a point that took 9 years of development for Space Engineers 1. Let that sink in for a minute. It's sinking. It's sinking. It's sinking. And we're already moving towards multiplayer, FPS AI, and the Warfare 3 update in Space Engineers 1, which is insane, by the way. We'll have FPS AI in Space Engineers 2 at the end of the year, and Water next year sometime. Depending on the development schedule, we could potentially see many of those systems within roughly the second year or shortly after being basically mature. That is an example of an incredible pace compared to what many people expected from a project at this stage of development, and also what I've heard many people talk about from the first game and its slow development. I understand the community's concerns. I understand why many people still have a bad taste in their mouth. Space Engineers 1 took a very long time to develop, and many players believe it never received the systems or the depths that it needed. I understand that frustration because I felt it too. I stopped playing Space Engineers 1 for a long time for many of the same reasons. At one point, I needed roughly 83 different mods in one of my worlds just to create an experience I was somewhat happy with. And a lot of those were just catered towards the AI and the world building. The EEM mod and all of those, like, you know, drones and, you know, the ship packs and just some basic weapon stuff and that kind of thing. The saddest part was that Space Engineers 1 on its own was not a particularly good game. It was a fun game. It was a great sandbox. It was a great sandbox, but it was not a great game. Those are different things. A sandbox gives players tools. The game gives those tools context, purpose, pressure, and meaningful reasons to use them. And just to go back to the Space Engineers 1 comment, I mean that basically prior to the last 3 or 4 years, because they've really pulled it out from a bad spot, and they've really introduced some really awesome and interesting features. Although I don't think I could personally go back to Space Engineers 1. Space Engineers 2, I assume, will have all of those features, plus more. And that is what I believe Keen has the opportunity to change this time around. This is a fresh start. Keen has the opportunity to take the engineering sandbox that made the original unique, and for me personally, a cornerstone of my younger life, and build a real game world around it. That means the community needs to approach new ideas differently. Do not immediately assume that something is wrong, unnecessary, or out of place simply because it's new. Do not reject mechanics only because it was not part of Space Engineers 1. Let Keen experiment, let Keen build new systems, and let Keen take the risks necessary to make Space Engineers 2 more than a remake of the original. Criticism is important. Keen should still be challenged when something does not work. Like, for example, the Gatling gun. Completely justified. Sorry, guys, it was. It was, sorry. I have to be honest there. But criticism should be based on whether a system improves the game, and not simply whether a system is unfamiliar. This is their opportunity to build something better. And it is our opportunity as a community to stop holding the new game back by demanding it remain exactly like the old one. Thank you guys for your time, and, you know, I hope you enjoyed the video. Have a good one.